Good afternoon from Helsinki, Finland, and welcome to this webinar entitled Men and Gender Equality Policies. This webinar is the third and final event of a webinar series on men and masculinities from change and crisis to empowerment, which is organized by the Council for Gender Equality and Central Association of Men's Organizations in Finland and funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. My name is Taina Riski, and next to me is my co-host
Joonas Kekkonen.
And we will be moderating this event together. You can now see the program on the screen. We have 3 talks lined up today related to different approaches, experiences, and also future work on the role of men in gender equality policies. And towards the end of the program, we have dedicated a good amount of time for discussion and questions. We encourage you to make comments and ask questions throughout the webinar by using the chat available on the screen. So feel free even just to say hello and tell us and others where you're coming from. We have a great turnout for this event, over 200 registered participants, so we're looking forward to interesting conversations in the chat alone. That being said, due to the great number of participants, we won't be able to present all your comments or questions. Another practical note, we will take a small break after the second speaker and we'll notify you on the screen when the time comes. And lastly, this event will be recorded and the recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Council for Gender Equality. And if you missed the earlier events of this Nordic webinar series, you can find the previous recordings on this website too. But perhaps now a few words about the content. Joonas.
Thank you. Yes, the overall aim of our webinar series is to spark debate and share knowledge among researchers, policymakers and civil society representatives about men and masculinities in relation to gender equality in the Nordic and Baltic countries and beyond. In today's event, we are focusing on gender equality policies and how the issues related to boys and men are reflected in these policies. This webinar aims to answer the questions such as, are gender equality policies for men too? To what extent are men's issues reflected in Nordic gender equality policies? What has worked and what is still missing? And to answer these questions today, we have professionals from Iceland, Norway and Sweden.
Now, I think we are ready to move to the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker who comes from Iceland. Ingólfur Gíslason works as Associate Professor in the University of Iceland. Ingólfur has carried out extensive research and published several articles and books related to parental leave, care policies, gender equality, and the role of fathers as carers. We are really looking forward to hearing more about the Icelandic experience on sharing parental duties and what impact it has made in the last 20+ years in Iceland and in Nordic countries. So Ingólfur, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to briefly explain the Icelandic experience of providing fathers with a well-paid quota of parental leave. Next slide, please. It all began in the year 2000 when the Icelandic Parliament unanimously adopted a new law on parental leave, extending the period from 6 to 9 months and dividing it so that fathers had 3 non-transferable months, mothers 3 non-transferable months, and then there were 3 months that could be divided as the parents saw fit. In addition, economic compensation was changed from a low flat rate benefit to 80% of wages, and originally with no ceiling. And this was financed by an insurance levy paid by employers. And the aim of the law was twofold, namely to try to ensure that children would have good access to both parents and to try to make it easier for both parents to coordinate family life and paid employment. Next slide, please. It should also be noted that parents can be on leave together all the time or part of it, and they can be on part-time leave and part-time work. And the next one, please. There have been a few changes to the law, and one of them is an extension of the total length and changes in the quota system. In 2020, the leave was extended to 10 months, and each parent had 4 non-transferable months, while they could divide 2 as they saw fit. And in 2021, the total leave was extended to 12 months, 6 months for each parent, no shareable time, but each parent was entitled to transfer up to 6 weeks to the other parent. On the next slide. As mentioned earlier, the stated aim of the law is twofold: to try and ensure that children receive care from both parents, and to try to make it easier for both parents to coordinate family life and paid employment. The logic behind the division of the entitlement is based on this twofold aim. It is well known that shared entitlements are almost solely used by mothers. It is also well known that employers are much more skeptical to fathers taking parental leave than to mothers, so it is important that fathers can point out that if they don't take the leave, the family will lose it. On the next slide. In the original law from 2000, there was only one exception from the rule of non-transferability, and that was if either parent died before he or she had used its rights, then the period was transferred to the remaining parent. The exceptions have been increased over time and now include the following. A parent that has no right in Iceland and no right in another country can get the whole period. If one parent dies during pregnancy or before the child reaches 24 months, it can be transferred. And if a parent is unable to care for the child due to severe illness or accident, due to prison sentence, or due to restraining order, then the period can be transferred. It's also so that a single mother that has undergone assisted conception treatment can have all the 12 months, and a single parent that adopts or takes a child into permanent foster care can also have the whole 12 months. On the next slide, please. If we now take a look at the usage, there are 3 main things to be noticed in this perhaps a bit complicated slide. One is that the leave was immediately popular with fathers, over 80% making use of it the first year, and usage has been between 80 and 90% ever since. And the fathers that we are mainly losing, the fathers that are not making use of their rights, are mainly those who do not live with the mother. And secondly, we see that fathers use the non-transferable period, the period that only they can use, while mothers use the time allotted to them and the shareable time. And figures relating to the possibility of transferring the 6 weeks show that around 74% of parents do that, transfer the 6 weeks to one or the other, and of those cases, around 90-70% transfer from the father to the mother. And the third thing to notice is that the usage by fathers is more sensitive to changes in the economic compensation than the usage by mothers. The drop that you see in the usage by fathers from 2009 to 2017 is due to a severe lowering of the ceiling of economic compensation during the economic crisis in Iceland. As soon as that ceiling was raised again, we see increased participation by fathers. However, I think it is noteworthy that usage by fathers never went below 80%, even when the ceiling was so low that around half of the fathers had income over the ceiling. And finally, it should be noticed that the figures from 2023 and 2024 are preliminary. The final figures will be above 80%. The next slide, please. Now, we have conducted a long-time survey study among parents since the changes in the law in 2000. We asked them how they have divided care of their firstborn from birth until the child is 3 years old. The first one was conducted among parents that had their first child in 1997. That is 3 years before the change. And you can see the results here. The dotted line on top shows families where the mother was the main or the sole caretaker. The unbroken line shows families where childcare was evenly divided, while the broken line at the bottom shows families where the father was the sole or main caretaker. It's obvious that mothers dominate the care, and even when the child is 3 years old, the lines showing equal care and mother care never cross. Next sentence. The next survey was done among parents who had their first child in 2003, when the extension of the leave and the quota system had been fully implemented. And we see major changes. Now the lines showing equal care and mother care cross a few months before the child is 3 years old. And we even see an increase in cases where the father is the sole or main caretaker. The next sentence. The results for the study done among parents who had their first child in 2009 show similar development, as does the survey done among parents who had their first child in 2014. Next sentence. There the lines cross around the time when the child is around 1 year old. And when the child is 3 years old, 78% of parents claim that care is divided equally, compared to only 44% among those who had their first child in 1997. And we have continued these surveys. We've done 2 more, and the results continue to show the same development, although the changes are very small nowadays. On the next slide. Now, what these surveys and figures from the Parental Leave Fund show is that at least one of the goals of the law has been reached. Children nowadays have very good access to both parents from birth, and fathers have the possibility to do what they have wanted to do, namely to participate more in family life and caretaking of their children. And they have made use of that possibility. This has led to other changes. The continuous study by the World Health Organization called Health Behavior in School-Aged Children asks, among other things, about the relationship between adolescents and their parents. They ask how easy it is for the adolescents to come to their parents with their personal problems. The first cohorts in Iceland that benefited from the new law showed a major change as regards their possibilities to confide in their fathers, and Iceland now is on top in the world in that regard. And it should be noted that this has not changed the situation of Icelandic mothers or their connection to their adolescents. Mothers are still on top among the 42 countries that participate in the study. On the next slide. Another study has shown increased marital stability after the new law. Parents who had a child right after the changes in parental leave were much less likely to divorce than parents who had a child just before the law was implemented. And this seems to hold, as the same results are obtained 15 years after the implementation. And perhaps this should not be seen as surprising, as a number of studies have shown that equal sharing at home means greater marital satisfaction. On the next slide. However, there is no question that mothers are still the main parent in most families, at least when the children are very young. We see this, for example, in that mothers are more likely than fathers to use a shareable time, and that they are more likely than fathers to extend the leave by working part-time. The major reason for that seems to be that Iceland has a serious gap from the time when parental leave is over and to the time when children can get a place in preschool. And the next one. So all in all, this is a success story for all involved. Fathers use their quota and live richer family lives. Mothers are not alone in caretaking and have better opportunities to advance in the labor market. And children have better access to both their parents right from birth, and their risk of experiencing a divorce is greatly diminished. And the final one. I just want to thank you for your attention, and for those interested, here are a few references. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ingólfur, for a very, very interesting presentation. I had one question in mind that I wanted to ask you, but we already have a question for you also in the chat, so maybe I'll take up the question from the chat and I'll read it for you before you can answer. So very interesting results. Thank you. Does the Icelandic model recognize that families do not always consist of two parents, mother and father, and a child? What about, for example, same-sex parents or families with more than two parents or caretakers? How does the family leave work then? Is there research results for these families, and how do they use parental leaves? You can answer the question now, Ingólfur.
Okay. Same-sex parents have had the same rights as heterosexual couples right from the beginning. That is no problem. As for the second part of the question, no, the law does not recognize that there can be more than two parents. It always focuses just on two parents, and there have been no real discussions about changing that.
Okay, thank you. Since we still have a bit of time, I'm going to ask my question as well that I had in mind. Given that the parental law or the system has been in place for over 20 years, what is the impact of this model for men as caregivers? Do you see more men choosing professions as carers for children, young people and elderly?
No. Unfortunately, we do not see any movement in that direction. There may be a slight change regarding nurses. At least more men have applied to study to become a nurse, but so far it hasn't really materialized. The changes that we see are almost solely regarding their own children.
Okay, thank you. Well, we can certainly continue the discussion on this point as well, but I think we're now moving on. And Jonas, I give you the floor now.
Thank you. Okay, we'll be moving on to our next speaker, who comes from Norway. Christian Langsgaard works as head of department in Norwegian Directorate of Integration and Diversity. Christian was appointed as head of Secretariat of Men's Equality Commission for 1.5 years to lead the work for the Commission. Christian will now tell us more about the work of Commission and the report that was published with the aim of enhancing the recognition of men and boys in Norwegian gender equality policies in 2024. So it's a recent report. We look forward to hearing more about this work, and we are sure that you have a lot of good practices to share as well. So, Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see, I can't exactly see my own presentation on screen now, but I'm guessing you can. Here we are. Thanks. Well, thank you. My job, as you said, was to chair the secretariat of this Men's Equality Commission. I'll highlight a few of the findings from the report and give a few of the policy recommendations that was given from the committee. You can give me the next slide, please. Here we are. So this is the commission itself. It was appointed by royal decree in August of 2022 and consisted of these 17 individually appointed members. It was chaired by Klaus Jervel, who you'll see in the middle of the picture there. The commission published its final report in April last year. And well, you can give me the next slide, please. During the period that the commission worked, they held internal meetings, consultations with experts, dialogue meetings, and of course contributed to the public debate. So here's a brief overview of the 17 committee members, and as you can see, there were both men and women represented in the commission, as well as a non-binary person. As I said, these members were all individually appointed, meaning that they do not represent any particular groups or organizations. They all had different and quite relevant experiences from a wide variety of backgrounds, ranging from culture, sports, civil society organizations, research, public policy, and other professional experience. And as I understand it, I think Are Såstad, who you'll see here, who usually works at as the head of Reform Resource Center for Men in Oslo, in Norway, which is a politically independent non-profit organization. I understand that he has spoken at one of your events earlier. As for my role in this, I was a civil servant, and it was my job to lead the secretariat. For most of the period, we had 3 people working full-time in the Secretariat, and additional 2 more people were working with us for the final months of the project. Our job was to produce all the background information and that the Commission needed for their discussions, as well as arrange their meetings and events, and of course to write the report itself on their behalf. I'll just brief, if I can have the next slide, please, show you some highlights from the Commission's mandate. It was stated initially that while men as a group and on average constitute a majority within powerful political and economic positions, groups of men may still face gender equality challenges. And of course, the mandate also stated that the Commission should examine gender equality from an intersectional perspective. I think quite wisely, the Commission chose to address this not by having separate chapters on different minority groups of men, but by examining different minority groups within each theme of the report. And also the Commission was asked to discuss how norms of masculinity may be affecting gender equality issues. I can have the next slide, please. So this is the way the report was structured. I'll give a few highlights of their findings. You can give me the next slide, please. For those of you interested in reading the text in full, it's available, of course, in Norwegian with an English summary from page 21 of the PDF file that you'll find on the Norwegian government's website. If you can give me the next slide, please. I won't go into much detail here, but these are a few highlights from the Commission's perspective on gender equality. And I think what you need to understand here is that the Commission took a perspective that was explicitly not aiming to pit various groups against each other. And the Commission were working against the backdrop of understanding gender equality as something that benefits all groups. Of course, certain policies may be giving gains to certain genders. So the example of parental leave was a topic from Iceland we heard before. But as a whole, the perspective was that gender equality is something that that all genders gain from. There was a perspective also that there's a tendency in the public debate to treat problems that relate to boys and men as cases of men and boys being the problem. The Equality Commission believed that much of the destructive behavior that can perhaps be read as toxic masculinity or these types of behaviors are better to be understood as an expression of the problems that boys and men are facing. The Commission also highlighted that most, perhaps, boys and men do not believe that gender equality policies concern them, that they are mainly an issue for women's rights, but that's of course one of the main findings of the report is that also boys and men also stand to gain from being included in greater detail in gender equality policies. So if I can have the next slide, please, I'll try to take you through some selected findings in the report. Here you see grade point average differences between girls and boys by the end of compulsory education. And on average, boys fare worse in school than girls. But of course, there is a significant overlap. But you'll find that as a share of pupils with the highest grades, the share of girls is higher, and the entire distribution is skewed to the left, so to speak, with boys on average having poor grades in all subjects except, of course, for physical education, as is stated here. I'll take you through the next slide, please. We also see in higher education that fewer boys than girls are enrolled in higher education. This graph here shows the share of women in higher education in Norway from 1974 to 2020. And as you can see, by 2020, the gender imbalance has been reversed, where men now represent a minority at the same level that women did in the 1970s. There is a particularly low proportion of men enrolled in teacher training and study programs in pedagogy and health and social care. Also, we see that far fewer men with disabilities enroll in higher education, and also that gender, family background, immigrant background, and place of residence are significant for school performance and educational choices. You can give me the next slide, please. As for working life, Norwegian working life is characterized by a relatively high employment rate and generally small gender differences in employment. However, there are some significant differences in terms of where women and men are working. Men are largely employed in the private sector, where 8 out of 10 men work in the private sector, compared to 5 out of 10 women. And of course, in the public sector, men make up a clear minority of employees. We also see that only 13% of all employed men work in female-dominated industries, and vice versa. This, I think, is quite often the case in other countries as well. Among migrant workers in Norway, 3 out of 4 are men, and migrant workers make up a significant proportion of the workforce in several male-dominated industries. And as you'll see in these industries, research indicates that there are fewer family-friendly working life standards in male-dominated workplaces, and that in male-dominated industries, there is a tendency for higher than average risk of work-related illness and injuries. As for health, if I can have the next slide, please. This graph, I think, is especially striking. So here you see expected expected living age at the age of 40, sorted by gender and income. So here you'll see that the poorest 1% of the population are on the left side of this graph, and the richest 1% on the right. And as you can see, for both men and women here, the richer you are, the longer you're expected to live, basically. But these differences are particularly strong for men. The differences in life expectancy between those with the highest and the lowest income is 8.4 years for women and a staggering 13.8 years for men, meaning that the life expectancy for the poorest percent of men in Norway is about 14 years less than the richest 1% of men. Also, we see that far more men than women die as a result of drugs, accidents, and mental illness, and of course suicide during adulthood. Men also have a high risk of contracting and dying from cancer, and more men than women die from communicable diseases before the age of 75. And these diseases are in many ways preventable, which leads me to the next slide regarding health services. As you'll see in the next slide here, men tend to be overrepresented among those who do not seek primary health care, primary health services. They tend to go to the general practitioner less often, even when issues related to pregnancy and childbirth are included. I'll try to speed up and we'll take to the next slide. This, I think, is a very under-communicated finding, which is that almost half of male respondents in a 2022 study stated that they have been subjected to serious physical violence one or more times after the age of 18. Violence between men tend to not be seen as a question related to gender equality, but perhaps it should be. Surveys, of course, also show that the majority of those who perpetrate violence are men, and anger management programs are often inadequate. If I can have the next slide, please. Certain men, especially older men, single men, and men with an immigrant background are overrepresented among those who have weak social networks and few people they can trust if they encounter difficulties. Men use both legal and illegal drugs to a greater extent than women. Young men have a lower voter turnout than women, and these gendered differences have increased over time. And surveys of attitudes to freedom of expression actually indicate that more men than women find that freedom of expression is limited. It is particularly men who believe that political correctness is a major problem in Norway. And if you can give me the next slide. We also find that certain groups in the population are more at risk for marginalization, and gender seems to be a compounding factor here. Queer men, Sami men, and men belonging to visible minority groups, they experience hate speech more often than others, and persons who belong to multiple minority groups are particularly vulnerable. Surveys also show that boys and men belonging to an ethnic minority more often experience discrimination. Now, these are some of the findings from the report. So if you can give me the next slide, please, I'll say a few words briefly about the proposed policy measures that the committee delivered. These were divided into 35 concrete policy measures they suggested within 4 priority areas: men as caregivers, gender differences in education and working life, vulnerability and health, and an equality policy pertaining to all. So if you can give me the next slide, please, I'll briefly state that one of the things that the Commission suggested was to do changes to the parental benefits scheme. Very interesting to hear the findings from Iceland, and the Norwegian experience is completely in line with the Icelandic experience. Fathers tend to use only their allotted share of the quota, while mothers tend to use their share and the transferable quota. So to address this, the Commission suggested to expand parental benefit scheme with 4 weeks equally divided among the parents, and to by default grant all parents 25 weeks of paid leave with up to 6 weeks transferable to the other parent. 3 weeks should be specifically for mothers before the due date, and also in order to ensure that fathers are actually present for the formative years of the parenthood. The period available for parental leave was suggested to be shortened from 3 years of age to 2 years of age. I'll run through a few of these proposed policies, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions afterwards. If I have the next slide, please. The committee also suggested to introduce a flexible school start. This measure involves expanding the possibility for children to start school earlier or later than August of the year they turn 6. So The aim of changing the conditions for flexible school start was to give parents greater room to delay school starts for both girls and women, but the idea is both girls and boys. But it was a clear case of non-gendered policy aimed at targeting boys specifically. So the majority of the committee suggested that the measure should not be limited to children born at certain times of the year, and the minority of the committee believes that measures should be reserved for children born only in the autumn. I understand that the use of flexible school start is not as high in Norway as in countries we could perhaps be compared with, such as Denmark. So I'll be interested in hearing if any in the audience have experience with this from the Danish context. If I can have the next slide, please. The committee also suggested to ensure a right to apprenticeship in vocational training. This is a critical time in education where boys tend to drop out of vocational training at a higher level than girls, with, of course, significant consequences for their lives afterwards. So the committee suggested that all students in vocational upper secondary education be granted a right to an apprenticeship placement. If I can have the next slide, please. The Commission also suggested a national initiative to ensure that more men choose and complete educations within healthcare, social and teaching subjects. There is a need for more men in the healthcare, social work and educational study programs, and the committee compared the efforts to increase the share of female students in male-dominated areas and found that these were not being met by the comparable efforts to increase male representation in female-dominated fields as well. If I can have the next slide, please. The Commission also stated that there should be efforts to establish a commission on men's health, which I understand has been done in more countries, I believe in the UK also recently. The Commission launched its report a few months after there was a Women's Health Commission who produced a report, and the Commission believes that there is a need for a similar commission on men's health. There is a lack of knowledge about men's physical, mental, and sexual health, and the committee suggested that there should be established a men's health commission as well. I know I'm approaching the end of my allotted time, but I'll briefly run through two more. This is a recommendation that has actually been implemented to establish more meeting places for boys and men, where actually the directorate where I work has just been granted 10 million kroner in order to establish more meeting places for boys and men. This has been labeled a crime preventative measure, and of course the inspiration here comes from the UK's Men's Sheds movement and Denmark's Men's Møtesteder, which have created similar spaces in those countries. I'll have the next slide, please. The committee also suggested to provide better help to victims of non-domestic violence. As I said, approximately half of the Norwegian male population have been exposed to violence in adulthood. And if I can have the final slide, please. This is, I think, a topic in several countries where the Equality and Anti-Discrimination Act specifically targets women and minorities. And the Men's Commission considers it a matter of principle that giving special priority to one gender in the purpose clause of the law is problematic. I think I'll stop there, and I'll be more than happy to answer some questions.
Thank you for your representation. Well, as a beginning question, how has the report been received? Has it been used? Has it been discussed in Norway?
Yeah, of course, I'm a bit biased in that respect, as I tend to follow the way the report has been received. We got a lot of media attention when the report was launched, also some internationally, and I believe that the timing of this commission was extremely good, and we seem to see a more nuanced discussion, I think, in Norway regarding gender equality and including a male perspective as well. For instance, I read the paper this morning, Aftenposten, Norway's one of Norway's largest newspaper. There was a commentary writing about the proposed changes in the Norwegian Children's Act. Where, of course, one of the issues relates to, as the Men's Equality Commission also suggested, greater use of joint custody for children after divorce, and this, of course, is a heated debate. But the report is quoted in news coverage still, and I believe that it has contributed to shifting the perspective in the public debate, at least somewhat.
Thank you. Yes, the discussion about divorce and childcare are usually amongst the first discussions. But there was a question from the chat. How many women will end up as academics in the future compared to men? And as a follow-up, did the report have recommendations on how to strive for equality and education, and what equality would even mean in these discussions?
Yes. For those of you familiar with the Norwegian context, this has been one of the main points from one of the committee members, Camilla Stoltenberg, who has written a similar report on gender differences in education before this. The Commission suggested a few measures to combat gender inequalities in higher education as well, such as to change the point calculation for primary and lower secondary school, so that, well, this is a bit technical perhaps, but you see in Norway, all the grade points of different subjects are not weighed equally, so that perhaps women who are performing better in certain academic disciplines get higher grade point averages because of systematic differences in how the grades are weighted. This is, I'm afraid, a bit more technical than I'm able to address in English here and now, but I'll be more than happy to show you the relevant place in the report for those of you who want to know more.
This is just one of those discussions that everyone is having in Baltic and Nordic area, because boys are failing somewhat in all these countries. And there's just last question from the chat. Do you think the report could be used outside of Norway to advance boys and men's gender equality?
Yes, I absolutely do. I know that we do have a fan in a writer that some of you may know, Richard Reeves, who wrote a really good book in 2022 of Boys and Men. He has since founded the American Institute for Boys and Men. We actually hosted Richard for a public event in Oslo during the period, and I understand that he's also established a British Centre for Policy Research as well recently. And I'll take it from him. The way he stated it was that coming from a country that seems to be safely within the feminist side, it seems to open up a space for also including a perspective on boys and men in a way that seems less polarizing, perhaps, than coming from other settings, I think. So at least I think the report has something to contribute to debates in other countries as well.
Thank you, Christian. I think perhaps we can send a message to the Norwegian government and to ask them to translate the full report in English, not just the summary. So I think it would be very beneficial if we could all read the report and see the measures and read the measures that you have suggested, introduced, and also make use of it in the Nordic countries, but also beyond Nordic countries in Europe and worldwide. But now, as promised, we will have a small break of 5 minutes, and we'll be back online after with our final speaker and the discussion session. So looking at the time, it's 13:51 here in Helsinki, so we'll be back at in 5 minutes, so 56. So 5 minutes, I'm going to be very strict, but we have a lot of questions and comments already in the chat, so we want to use as much time as possible for that. So see you soon. Welcome back. We will continue with our third presentation today, and our final speaker comes from Sweden. Kalle Berggren works as Associate Professor at the Department of Child and Youth Studies at the University of Stockholm. Kalle's research topics cover gender, masculinity, intersectionality, Swedish hip-hop, youth intimate relationships and violence. Kalle is also the Swedish representative in the board of the Nordic Association for Research on Men and Masculinities, Normas. Kalle is here to give an overview on how the masculinity and the role of men is reflected in the Nordic gender equality policy reports. And we're very interested in hearing what you have discovered in reviewing these Nordic reports. So Kalle, welcome, and please take the floor.
Thank you, Tiny and Jonas, and hello everybody. Now I don't see my slides. Okay, there they are. Great, thanks. So today I will present some preliminary findings from a study that I'm doing at the moment. It's called Masculinity in Nordic Gender Equality Policy 2019 to 24, and this is financed by NIC, the Nordic Information of Gender, which is a cooperation body under the Nordic Council of Ministers and based in Gothenburg. So and it was discovered that in the policy reports that are commissioned and financed by the Nordic Council of Ministers on gender equality, increasingly the word masculinity has emerged, and especially in this period from 2019 and forward. Next slide, please. So the question that I'm looking at is what happens when masculinity is named in gender equality policy reports. And there are 12 reports that I'm analyzing for this project. And in some of them, masculinity is named in passing, and there are passing references to masculine norms or concepts such as traditional norms of masculinity are mentioned, whereas in other reports, questions of men and masculinity are more explicitly in focus, such as there's one report on young men's mental health in the Nordic countries, one on angry men on the internet, and so on. So these are some of the covers of the reports that I'm looking into. So one first observation is that it's a really clear ambition to have Nordic gender equality policy anchored in contemporary research. So many of those reports are basically research overviews, and some of them are authored by researchers. So that's something really positive. Of course, it's not always uncomplicated, because there can be like different perspectives within research. There are different research fields with different emphasis, and many scholarly debates that are unconclusive. So it's not always straightforward, and sometimes it's not always straightforward to know, okay, we know this from research, but how should we create policy based on that? But I think that's something that is really positive, is this clear ambition to have gender equality policy based on contemporary research. Also, what's interesting is that when we talk about masculinity politics in the Nordic countries, I think it's fair to say that historically the emphasis has been on fathers or fatherhood, or making men into fathers, or involving men in parenting and so on. So that has been historically something that has been in focus when we're talking about men, masculinity, and gender equality in Sweden and in the Nordic countries in general. But what was interesting in these reports is that only 1 out of 12 focuses on fatherhood. So historically, that might have been the main focus for masculinity politics in the Nordic countries, but now masculinity is clearly relevant to a lot of other issues, as we also heard from Christian's presentation. So these reports cover other topics as well. So there are one is about fatherhood, but there are a few that are about education and working life. There are 3 reports about climate issues. There's one on young men's mental health issues, and one on and 2 which are about the digital sphere. So there are several different topics where men and masculinity are relevant, and sometimes questions about masculinity are mentioned more in passing in relation to those topics, whereas in other reports it's more explicitly in focus. Next slide, please. So when I'm trying to make sense of how masculinity is framed in these reports, can I have the next slide, please? Yes. So one way of thinking about the focus or emphasis in these reports is to look at this is a triangle that was created by an American scholar, Messner, in the mid-90s, but sort of is useful to think about the different emphasis that men's movements and masculinity politics can have, because we can talk about men's issues or men's politics or masculinity politics, but that can mean very different things. So in this triangle at the top, I call this, in this report, the problems men create. It's sometimes used different labels, like a focus on gender justice, or a focus on men's power and privileges. So that could be like something that can be in focus for men's movements and masculinity politics. And when we're talking about gender inequality, that's an orientation that has a sort of self-evident place in those discussions. But all men's movements and all policies about masculinity is not explicitly focused on dismantling men's power and privileges or seeking gender justice. There can also be other ways of emphasizing things. And in the left corner, we have the problems men face, or the problems men endure, the problems that men experience. So this is perhaps historically, we have seen in research that men's movements and politics around masculinity often tends to end up focusing on one of these. So either it's a clear focus on the problems men are creating, often for women, but also for society in general, or for the planet. Or the focus tends to be on the problems that men face or endure, the challenges that men have in schools, or in terms of mental health, or something else. So with the top of the triangle focuses on a more explicitly feminist political perspective, whereas the left corner is more associated with a men's liberation project or focusing on the problems that men endure. And the rightmost corner, differences between men, is also something that we need to think about when we talk about masculinity politics, because men is not a homogeneous category, and there are many subgroups within the big category of men. And who are we talking about when we are talking about men? Are we talking about wealthy men or poor men? Are we talking about heterosexual or queer men, and so on? So there are a lot of important differences that also could and should be taken into account, but it certainly varies to what extent differences between men are highlighted when we talk about different men's movements or masculinity politics. Okay, so I'm using this triangle as a way of structuring the different ways that masculinity issues are articulated in those reports by the Nordic Research Council. Next slide, please. So if we start with the problems men create, this of course has a sort of self-evident place in gender equality policy. And we can see that in, for example, reports focusing on men online, specifically angry men on the internet, or online misogyny, and the problem that we have with men engaging in sexist communities on the internet, such as incel forums. And in one of the reports, men's online misogyny is framed as a form of violence against women. So this means that it's clearly focused on the problems that men are creating for women and for women's participation in the public sphere and for society at large. So it's a problem that men are creating non-safe spaces on the internet, which in turn can affect to what extent women are willing to engage in politics or in the public debate, public sphere more generally. Next line, please. Another example comes from reports that are focused on education and work, and here we have this discourse that men's culture in male-dominated sector is an obstacle for women. So this also means that it's a focus on the problems men are creating. So we can see, according to a couple of the reports, that there has been an emphasis regarding male-dominated sectors and education. There has been an emphasis in, okay, we need to get the women in. So there has been a lot of initiatives that focus on mentoring women or getting women to apply for educational programs in classically male-dominated sectors. But according to some of the reports, there has been too much emphasis on trying to attract women and getting the women into the male-dominated sectors. And from a critical perspective, we can say that if we put too much emphasis on recruiting women, it sort of implies that the problem is with the women and they need to be fixed. We need to fix the women in order to get more gender equality in male-dominated sectors. But maybe we need to move away from that, and we could have a more clear focus not on what the women lack that makes the women not apply for or seek jobs in male-dominated sectors, but we could also think more critically about the male-dominated culture, which maybe is something that makes women reluctant to seek out those kinds of educations or jobs. So this is also part of the focus on the problems men create, that we need to talk about men's culture or masculine norms or masculine culture as a problem, and it's a problem that has effects on women and women's participation and equality. Okay, next please. A third example is on the problems men create, not just for women specifically, but for in general, and it concerns men's preferences for eating meat and driving cars, which is conceptualized as a threat to the climate. So here we can see that masculinity politics is not just about like parenting and who is taking the what shares of the parental leave, which of course is an important aspect of gender equality, but we can see that questions about gender and masculinity is clearly relevant to a lot of other things which are simultaneously very personal, like what do I eat for dinner or how do I commute to work, but it's also like very structural and is implicated in the larger societal challenges. So these are three examples of when men and masculinity is named as a problem, with the focusing on the problems that men create, often for women and for gender equality, but also creating problems more generally, such as men's preferences in terms of eating meat and driving cars becomes a threat to climate and progressive policy with regards to climate change. Okay, next slide, please. So we can also say that there are reports that are not so focused on the problems men create, but there's more emphasis on the problems that men face, or the challenges that men face, or the problems that men endure. And next line, please. And there we have an example of men. Next click, please. Yeah, so in one of the reports focused on young men and mental health, there is an emphasis on men having difficulties seeking help for mental health problems specifically, due to masculinity norms. So here, masculinity is named as a problem, but it's not a problem for women or a problem for the climate or a problem for society in general, but masculinity is something that is a problem for men. So men have difficulties seeking help for their mental health problems due to masculinity norms. It is a problem, but it's a problem that restricts or hinders men. And another example, next click, please, is from one of the reports discussing men's online misogyny. And here it's a discussion focused not so much on how incel communities and other online misogynistic forums is an obstacle to women, which we saw in one of the other reports. But in this report, it's very much focused on why young men or men in general are attracted to sexist groups on sexist communities on the internet. And in this report, these sort of universal psychological needs are highlighted, like everybody has a universal need to belong and to have a support community and so on. And engaging in anti-democratic forums online is seen as a coping strategy when one is faced with social rejection. So men's sexism online is discussed in the reports from sort of different perspectives. So in one of the reports, there's a clear focus that we need to think about this as a form of violence against women. And there the focus is on how this can be a problem for women's democratic participation. But in another report, it's focus is much more on like the universal psychological needs that make some men turn to anti-democratic forums as a coping strategy for dealing with challenging life events. So then it's not so much framed as a problem for democracy or for women's participation, but it's a problem for men themselves, that they don't have sufficient effective communities for seeking help when they face social rejection or feel bad in other ways. Next slide, please. Yes, and one more. Yes, and this is a quote from the report on fathering, and just to illustrate this, and it says that it is abundantly clear that when fathers take longer leave, they experience a range of benefits, from better relationships with the parents, greater satisfaction with the involvement they have with their children, to even experiencing a higher level of life satisfaction. So here we can see the discourse is that there are a lot of benefits for men to take a greater share of parental leave. Next click, please. So the message, I think, is that men lose out from not taking the equal share of parenting and of parental leave. And there are a lot of things to be gained for men themselves if they could be more active as parents and be more involved and take a greater share of parental leave. But there's no mention of what men gain from not taking parental leave. So from a more critical perspective, we can also say that maybe there are things that men gain from letting women do all of the unpaid labor regarding taking care of the home, taking care of the children, and so on. So the discourse here is that there's a problem that men face, that they are sort of losing out of not being involved parents, but there's no mention really of like what men gain from what men gain from those unequal gender arrangements at the expense of women's unpaid labor concerning children and home. Okay, so we can see that there are some different emphasis there. Sometimes the reports are clear about the problems men are creating, and in some of the reports there's more this discourse of the problems men endure or the problems men face, and how can we sort of improve life quality for men in different ways. Next slide, please. It's also interesting to think about the differences between men. As also was highlighted by Christian and from the Norwegian report. And this is a kind of a discourse that we can see in several of the reports. And I read, Nordic women are not a homogeneous group. Neither are Nordic men or people who define themselves beyond or between the binary gender system. How gender identities are combined with statuses such as socioeconomic background, ethnicity, disabilities, age, sexual orientation, and gender expression plays a crucial role in terms of an individual's situation and position in society. So we can see that there is a sort of a clear intersectional ambition in many of the reports, not in all of them, but in the majority, that it's important not just to think about men and women as the only categories that exist, but if we have to have a good analysis and effective policy, we also need to think about the differences between different subcategories of women or subcategories of men, and there are a lot of different aspects related to age, disability, sexuality, race, and ethnicity, etc. Next click, please. And one more, yes. So if we think about the different categories, we can see that when it comes to age or different life stages, there is actually quite a good representation. Some of the reports focus on small children and early childhood education. There are reports on young men's mental health, and there are reports on adult men and the labor market and so on. There's no mentioning of older men in these reports. And of course, I'm looking at this only 12 reports, so maybe we can't expect them to be fully representative of all issues. But in these reports, at least, there's no explicit focus on older men and gender equality. Next click, please. But in general, I would say that it's often mentioned that it's important to have an intersectional perspective, as in the quote I just read to you. But I would also say that there's a relative lack of explicit focus on minorities. So I think sometimes we have this discourse that it's okay, it is important to have this intersectional perspective and to think about the diversity, but then the question becomes, okay, but how does this translate? And I think that there is real potential for having a more explicit focus on different minorities, and this can mean LGBTQ men, can mean men from religious minorities. It could be racial and ethnic minority men with disabilities, who may in some ways have privileges as men, but can also face a lot of discrimination and vulnerability in different ways. And maybe it could be helpful to focus more directly on the experiences and perspectives of different minorities. So when we talk about intersectionality in research, it can be done in different ways, but one of the more influential strategies in research is to actually start off from the experiences of different forms of marginalized groups and see what are the main issues that we can identify in their experiences. So that could be something that could be one thing that could be addressed more explicitly, I think, in the Nordic gender equality policy when we are talking about questions about men and masculinity. And sometimes this is due to a lack in research, and then it's not so much that you can do in a policy report. In other cases, maybe we can think more about the policy reports could actually focus more on different minorities and their experiences and see does this change what problems are in focus and how we can think about different strategies in policy. Okay, next slide, please. And yes, so the key takeaways so far, this is work in progress, and my report will be published sometime after the summer, but the reports are clearly research-based. They have an ambition to be the policy should be based on research, and they cover a wide range of topics. It's not just only fatherhood, but a wide range of topics, including questions about education, online misogyny, mental health, and so on. Next, please. And we can think about the different emphasis between the problems men are creating for others and the problems that men face or endure. And this is something that needs to be balanced, I think. And this is sort of a challenge that has been there ever since we've seen men's movements. Like, should the focus be on the problems that men are creating for women and for women's participation, or should the focus be more on the problems men are facing and that men need to be liberated from restrictive norms of masculinity? And sometimes this can be balanced, and sometimes the emphasis tends to be on one or the other. But this is, like, I think, an important issue to always keep in mind when we're talking about masculinity and gender equality in policy. And finally, next click, please. It's great that there is this ambition to have an intersectional perspective and to think more carefully about the differences between men, but I can see that there's also a potential for a more explicit focus on minorities of different kinds. So that more could be made, even though it's good that there's an ambition to think about those issues. Okay, next. Thank you for listening, and any questions and comments are appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalle, very much for your interesting presentation. We already have a couple of questions for you in the chat. First one is a very practical one, and I think you actually replied to it again, but maybe it would be better if you have exact date when the report will be available.
There's no exact date at the moment, but later this year. That's the plan.
Okay, thank you. There's another question in the chat. Actually, this is referring to the reports that you have reviewed. Is there a reason why you have chosen to use the term masculinity in the title of the study and not men and boys? Maybe you can also refer to the reports and the titles of the reports.
Yes, thank you. I was asked to, it was noticed by Nick, Nordic Information on Gender, that the word masculinity has started to appear in those reports financed by the Nordic Research Council. So that was the task I was given, to look at what happens when the word masculinity is used, what kind of perspective is used, how does this align with the different perspectives in research, and so on. So that was the reason from the beginning, but I think in research we often use those concepts together, like men and masculinities, critical studies on men and masculinities. So it doesn't really signify a big difference for me whether we talk about issues about men and boys or whether we talk about masculinity politics.
Mm-hmm. I also have a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation that there should be more focus on minorities and maybe diversity in the reports. But in terms of thematic approach, you mentioned that the reports cover a number of different themes and topics. But what is missing, in your view, as a researcher? What are the topics that are not discussed and should be brought onto the agenda?
Yes, thank you. And that is also something that I will write about in this report that I'm working on. And yes, there are of course many different issues that have to do with gender, and I'm looking at 12 reports, and of course 12 reports can't cover all of the many different topics that have to do with gender relations and gender equality and men and masculinities. But so one thing is that, okay, how are different minorities framed or focused, but also like what are the other main areas that could be more in focus? For instance, there's nothing about sports. There is very little about culture. So that could be something that we could look more into. But it could also be that there are reports in the different Nordic countries about these topics, and maybe everything shouldn't be covered by the specific reports that are commissioned by the Nordic Council of Ministers. So that's also but that was something that I noticed, that there's nothing about sports or sort of masculine dominated communities, and also like after Me Too, perhaps we would have expected to see more about cultural industries or culture, perhaps. I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, as a last question to Kalle about this, let's take one last question. How do you see that your report can be used in the future, and how it will affect the future reporting?
Yes, thank you. It will not have specific policy recommendations. Okay, this is the way that we should now be doing gender equality policy, but it's more of a sort of meta reflection on what are the different perspectives used, in what way is the concept of masculinity employed, what are the different emphases. So I see it more that as a tool that can be used to think about what are the different emphases, and how do we think about what it gets constructed as a problem. When is it a problem for boys or men? When is it a problem for women? When is it a problem for society or for the climate? So perhaps giving us some tools to think more carefully about how we create or frame the problems when we talk about gender equality and issues about masculinity.
Thank you. And now it's time to open the floor for discussion among all speakers. We have about half an hour for questions and comments addressed to all the speakers and topics that we have heard about today. So let's have a look and let's see what we have in chat and what has been asked beforehand. Question we've been asked before the webinar and during the webinar was that how can we get men into these discussions and how are they involved at the moment? Whether it's parental leave, whether it's gender equality policies, how do you see the men's role in these discussions and how we could men more involved in these discussions? Ingelfur, would you like to go first?
Yes, okay. Well, generally, men are not all that involved in these discussions, and I, of course, am of the opinion that they should participate more. And it's easy to see that they generally participate if they see some issue where they are at a disadvantage. The discussion, for example, about the situation of boys in schools, their underperformance in school, that is something that engages men. Unfortunately, that discussion has a tendency to move over to seeing the problem as lying with some old-fashioned masculinity traditions among boys and men, and a certain refusal to try and broaden the horizon and see if there is anything in the school system as a whole that is creating these problems for boys. But issues like that, issues where we can be concerned about our boys or concerned about the lives of men, that is something that can engage men.
Thank you. And Christian, how do you see these discussions with men and how to get them involved?
I think, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, as I think I said, there seems to be an impression among boys and men that at least gender equality issues is not primarily aimed at boys and men, and I think, as you said, that certain issues such as parental leave, child custody, these seems to be more available to men as valid topics to have an opinion on. But this may not be a direct answer to what you're asking, but it strikes me that when the Commission had their internal discussions, it was pointed out by someone that whereas discussions about men's issues are often centered around norms of masculinity, while discussions pertaining to women's rights are not to the same extent linked to our understandings of femininity. In fact, a few of the female members of the committee stated that it would seem slightly absurd to be asked about how your own expectations of gender norms or your understanding of femininity is relevant for a political discussion about gender equality. And that's, I don't know, that's perhaps more of a question I have that I would like to hear your response to Kalle, because is there a similar awareness about femininity's role in gender inequality as compared to masculinity?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in terms of research, the word masculinity is used much more than the word femininity, although there is some emerging discussions about femininity studies and girlhood studies and so on. About getting men involved in discussions, I think it's a bit tricky. We need to think about it at different levels, because on a general level, the reason we want to talk about those issues is that we see that there's a problem of gender inequality, and that men are often the problem or creating problems for others. But on the other hand, nobody wants to be approached as a problem, and that could be like when we think about talking with boys and men, maybe it's not always the most helpful strategy to approach persons as problems. That will put people in a defensive mode and so on. So I'm thinking about work that is being done with boys and young men on violence prevention, for example. So previously the focus was that we need to teach girls to have strategies of self-protection, and we need to teach boys that they should not commit violence or become perpetrators. But that was a bit problematic, even though it was a good intention, because nobody likes to be approached as a potential victim or potential offender. But now the emphasis is much more on talking to people that as bystanders, that we can all be bystanders, we can all be witness to problematic situations, and we need to develop our capacity to intervene. So the idea is that we approach young men and boys by approaching them as being able to take an active, positive role, and then that could have that could possibly affect how they behave also in their relationships. Yeah. So finding ways of talking to persons that doesn't position them as merely problems. That is one thing that is important. And also thinking about diversity, also related to what Ingolfur said, that, okay, when are people experiencing disadvantages? So if I am facing a lot of racism, for instance, then maybe that is that needs to be the starting point, and then we can sort of add in questions about gender. Or if I'm discriminated as a disabled person, okay, maybe that needs also be part of the conversation, and gender can have a role there. So maybe we shouldn't always start with gender, but think about different routes to integrating gender and masculinity issues in more intersectional conversations.
Yeah, if I can just comment, because as you were speaking, I work with diversity and social inclusion in my current job, and there's a book from the racism discrimination literature that springs to mind as you were speaking. I don't remember who wrote it, but the term was white fragility, and it's sort of it labels the certain type of defensiveness that white people can experience when discussing racism. We sort of do not want to be associated with this problem. I'm an avid anti-racist. This is not my responsibility. And it seems like a version of the same dynamic might be at play when, at least I experience it personally as a man, if I'm expected to own up to violent men's acts. I'm sorry, that's not really a discussion that I want to be a part of, and it sort of makes me a bit defensive and makes me want to not get involved, to be honest.
Yes, and we should also acknowledge that there's a lot of discussions going on. So it's not like there's a blank slate and now we need to come and talk about these issues, because there are, I guess, a lot of negotiations going on within families. Okay, who should take the more responsibility for the children, and who is taking the parental leave, and yeah, and in all sorts of organizations and working life, there are a lot of discussions that are like ongoing, and maybe they need to be amplified and more, but the problem is maybe not that just we need to introduce it, because we can't have the assumption that nothing is going on, because a lot of things is going
on. Actually, I have a follow-up question to this conversation that you just have been having. What do in your mind should be the approach? Should there be a more structural approach when we discuss the role of men in relation to gender equality, like it is for when we talk about women and gender equality? We often talk about structures, rather than femininity, like you mentioned. But at the same time, you also noted, Kalle, at least, that the masculinity as a term is much wider, at least in the ongoing research, existing research. What would be a sort of the strategy, a communication strategy as well, in order to sort of to get more men on board? Why do not men find the ongoing gender equality discussion interesting enough for them to join?
If I may.
Yeah, and then we can move on to Ingolfur and Kalle. Yes, please go.
Yeah, sure, because I would suggest paternity leave as the immediate starting point. I think, at least for exposing men to the experience of being a caring parent, the first years of parenthood are incredibly important. And I think, well, if you ask people in Norway, at least, what types of gender equality measures they have more or less a positive view on, the entire population is really happy with paternal leave, and in fact, men are more happy with the father's quota than women. And I think any all efforts to increase parental leave, I think will be for the good. I don't know how that sounds to the rest of you.
Well, we have a similar experience. I mean, this is a very popular change that has been made in the laws on parental leave, and also other changes such as the possibility, or more than possibility, it's now the main rule that after divorce, caretaking is divided between parents. If they do not want to have shared care after divorce, they have to negotiate away from it, not to it, as it was in the well, a few decades ago. And this has obviously been popular. And I mean, teachers, preschool teachers, all the teachers, they tell us that men are much more active in schoolwork today when it regards their own children. They bring their children to the preschools, they collect them, they participate in parent-teachers counselings and so on and so forth. So this has really moved things forward in my opinion. A general problem regarding men who want to participate in discussions on gender equality is that very soon after they have spoken or written in an article in newspapers or spoken in TV shows or something like that, some from the old guard of feminists intervene and ridicule them for not using the right lingo or not speaking in the right voice. They tend to give the tone for the replies that men receive when they want to participate. I really have no solution for that problem, but this is something that many men experience, and they move out of the discussion. They thought they were doing the right thing, saying the right thing. This was a problem, and it has to do with gender equality. And why is it felt that I said something ridiculous?
And Kalle, what are your views on this?
Yes, I think there needs to be a range of different strategies depending on what issues we're talking about. So some of the issues are problems within work organizations, and then we maybe need to talk about how can we have effective policies against sexual harassment at work. Some questions are more about personal life, which is like who's taking care of the children, or like what are we eating, how are we commuting to work. Then that maybe needs to have a different kind of discussion. And some questions are related to older men. Maybe they need more support sometimes to have a better social network. And some things are about boys and young men, and then we need ways to reach them and make them feel that they don't have to be in this very narrow, restricted way as a boy. So I think there has to be, and there can't be one overall strategy, but has to be a lot of different strategies depending on who is the target group and what is the problem that we are more specifically talking about.
Thank you.
This structuralist approach that we have taken to parental leave seems to have worked everywhere in Nordic countries. In Finland, we just had our results that when we gave more allocated time to fathers, they used it and they are happy about it. And why are we not having the same kind of discussion, for example, about education and boys' situations? We are just talking about that there is a problem and that it's something that is an ongoing discussion about masculinity once again, not a discussion about the structures that may not benefit boys and what policies we should create. This is something that we all experience, but are there actually discussions about education and policies in your countries, and what discussions are being had about this? Kalle, do you have an... Ingolfur, do you have an...
Well, just briefly, yes, we certainly have had these discussions, and many solutions have been proposed. The most radical is probably the policy that you may have heard about, and is called Hjallastefnan, which involves separate education for boys and girls. Not all of the time, but most of it, so that they are in different classrooms, and then they have separate the education in some areas where girls are taught to be more forward and more trusting themselves and so on and so forth, while the boys get education in caring, self-caring and caring for others and so on and so forth. This has spread in Iceland. It began in preschools, but now we also have it in elementary education. I have doubts about it, but this certainly is a structural approach, and as far as I know, the only structural approach that has been attempted in Iceland. We've also had discussions about the importance of getting more men as teachers, so that they can be seen as role models, and perhaps they would understand boys better than the women who completely dominate the teacher's profession in Iceland, and probably in the other Nordic countries as well.
Kalle.
Yes, I think like the public discussion in Sweden on boys and schools is something that comes and goes. And in the last few years, there hasn't been so much discussion about failing boys or so. We have a lot of discussion in public debate about boys from disadvantaged areas who are liable to becoming part of criminality and gang criminality. And in those discussions, maybe we need much more gender perspectives as well. But sometimes this discussion comes up about boys and anti-school culture, but I think it can also be a bit too generalized, and we need to think more carefully about some boys are very high achieving in school, some are failing, so it's not just like boys in general. So it can be, it has to do with a lot of other factors such as class and which parts of the country and which parts of Stockholm, if you're talking about Stockholm and so on. But also under the surface, I think maybe not in the public debate, but it's been working with teacher education to some extent, like all teachers to be now, they're trained a little bit in norm critical educational perspective. So they come out working in schools a little bit equipped, at least with gender and queer perspectives. So that is something that has not been so much part of the public debate, but also something that is changing and is hopefully something that will create better opportunities for girls and boys and non-binary students in Sweden.
Thank you. I'm actually looking at the chat because I think we already had quite a few questions in the beginning of this webinar, and I have one now for Ingolfur related to your presentation. So I'm going to take that now. Do you see any connection between the use of fathers' parental leaves and the reduction of men's violence against women? Is there any research on this connection?
Well, not that I'm aware of, not directly linking these issues. And as is well known, research on violence, and particularly perhaps domestic violence, is a very difficult field. There are different definitions. What we call violence changes from one time to another, from one group to another, and so on and so forth. But as a matter of fact, I'm writing about this right now, and there are indications, but they're just indications. I want to stress that violence against women is going down in Iceland. That it is less today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. But connecting that to the parental leave by men is of course very problematic. There are many other things that have been changing, and perhaps the much stronger situation of women today than 10 and 20 years ago is more is a better explanation than the parental leave. But to return to the question, no, there are no direct research that links these two.
Okay, well, thank you. At least the question got answered by you.
Although if someone else has some information, Kalle, Christian, this is something that probably there may be correlation, but it's hard to prove anything about use of parental leave.
Just add that I can just add that it's interesting that questions about fathers and getting fathers involved is often discussed separately from questions about violence. So of course it's great though if we can get more fathers to be more involved as parents, but also if you think about who is committing violence in families, it's most often men. So that's also something that we maybe need to think more about. And also men who have used violence against their children or against their women partners, they are often fathers also. So that's also a complication. So it's maybe in policy terms, it often gets like, okay, we have this issue about parental divisions, and then we have this other policy issue about violence, and then we have this other policy issue. But sometimes they are also more interrelated, and it's also important to take that into account.
Just there, that was the reason why one of the changes was made in the possibility of transferring parental leave from one parent to the other in Iceland. So if a parent is under restraining order due to use of violence, the other parent can have all the 12 months. Just to, yeah. So sometimes we think about the issues together.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
And maybe as a last question, that's always the hardest one. We have a question that was asked beforehand for all the participants. What specific inequalities concern men, and which topics should be addressed in the equality policies that have been forgotten? And maybe if there's something that is just surfacing in the discussion, you can discuss it. Who wants to go first? Christian?
I need a minute to think, I'm afraid.
So, Kalle?
Yes, it's a good question, but also a difficult question. What has been forgotten? Yeah, I think that from the reports that I'm analyzing, I think like diversity of men is recognized, but more needs to be done to talk about the different experiences that different groups of men, especially different kinds of minorities, have. So it's not completely forgotten, but I think that is something that we need to pay more attention to. So if I should choose something, that's what I will choose.
After having thought for a minute, at least one issue springs to mind, and that is related to the field I'm working on right now, which is honor-based violence, where I think that the idea of men and boys being both victims of a certain honor-based culture and being forced into a type of controlling of their female family might be at least one of the overlooked parts of men's structural inadvantages, I think, because it tends to view at least certain groups of minority men as perpetrators of honor-based violence, which is discriminatory in and of itself, and I think that's a sort of a field that tends to be associated with females as victims, which is of course also the case. So I think having nuanced discussions about honor-based violence and how masculinity plays into that is, at least from my perspective, a bit overlooked.
Thank you. And Ingolfur.
Well, just shortly, I think we should try to avoid polarization, to talk about men are like this and women are like this, because it is much more complicated. And for violence, domestic violence, for example, there's not really that much difference today between the experience of men and women as both perpetrators and victims of domestic violence, although they, as you move to the most serious cases of violence, men are much more likely to be the perpetrators, but not in the lesser degree. And the same goes for the problem that men create by eating meat and driving cars and so on. Perhaps we should also mention that women are much more likely to buy more clothes than they have any need for, and that they also use perfume and so on, which is dangerous for the environment. So let's not polarize that men are bad and women are good, or the other way around. It's much more complicated than that.
Well, thank you. I'm looking at the time, and I think our webinar time is up and it's coming to an end. And first of all, I want to thank all our speakers for your presentations and your contributions in the debate. And of course, I want to thank all the participants for your very active participation, not only in this seminar, but throughout the 3 webinars, because this also ends our webinar series that we've been having this spring. It's sure that the conversations and debate on men and masculinities will continue in other forums, in other events, and we hope that you all have gotten some insights, new insights of some of the topics that we addressed in this webinar series. But now it's time to say goodbye from Helsinki, Finland, and I want to wish you all a very nice rest of the day. Bye.